So there's a division of labor. International community takes the senior leaders, and domestic courts take the lower level leaders. Now just very quickly, I've already mentioned a few of the different players in these tribunals. Right? We've got the victims, we've got the crimes, we have the defendants. We also have prosecutors, of course. The prosecutors at the tribunals come from all over the world, although more often than not, so far they've come from the West. So you see in the center Louise Arbour, who was the High Commissioner for Human Rights just a few years ago. She was the second chief prosecutor of the ICTY, and she, in the middle of the war in Kosovo, so exactly 10 years ago, she indicted Slobodan Milosevic, which was a very risky move, right? Indict the president of a country in the middle of a war. She was seen as I guess mavericky would be the word we use today. But the idea that she could prosecute, she could indict somebody in the middle of a war, raised the question of, well, what if we're heading towards a peace process? Right? What do we do with Slobodan Milosevic? Milosevic is now an indicted criminal, or an indicted war criminal. Right? It makes it a lot harder for others to negotiate with him, to shake his hand in the negotiation, and try to figure out how to move forward. Right? So suddenly, international justice is a player. Right? The International Tribunal is a player in international politics. So here we have different prosecutors. They come, again, from all over the world. We have judges, again, coming from all over the world. Here we see in the top left Patrick Robinson of Jamaica, who is now the president of the ICTY, which means he's also the chief judge, the senior-most judge at the ICTY. Next to him in the blue is a man named Philippe Pirsch, who is the president of the International Criminal Court, who's a Canadian diplomatic lawyer. I have nothing against diplomatic lawyers. Diplomatic lawyers as judges, I don't know about, but Kirsch is the senior judge at the ICC. He's from Canada. He was also the chairman of the Rome Statute that adopted the ICC. So he's a very savvy political and diplomatic operator. So what I'm going to do is actually take a break for a second, and we're going to switch the inputs here. And I've been working with this will be an opportunity to sort of launch into the question period, essentially. Instead of talking only about what the international tribunals are, I want us to transition to talking about what their purposes really are. Why do we have them? And whether we think they're a good thing. So I'm working with a documentary filmmaker named Edward Nachtrieb, who's made some really wonderful films in the past. And he's interested in the issue of what is the impact of international justice, right? What is the impact on the ground? So all of this stuff that we're talking about, men in robes or generals wearing fatigues or whatnot, how does trying these people actually make a difference, and what is the point of it? So this is about a little less than 10 minutes, sort of a sample reel of interviews for the film that we're making, and then we'll continue back to talk a little bit about what the purposes of international justice are.
Bosnian Serbs surrounding Sarajevo implemented a military strategy that used shelling and sniping to kill, maim, wound and terrorize the civilian inhabitants of Sarajevo. It is alleged that thousands of civilians, including children and the elderly, were killed and wounded.
Da unutra sve pobiju, eventualno što ne pobiju da protjeraju I da time proglase samim padom grada Sarajeva, da proglase Bosnu I Hercegovinu sastavnim dijelom Velike Srbije.
The front line was there, you see? That was the front line. Just the end of the houses, beginning of mountain, and then you go 360 degrees and, you know, we're surrounded from all sides. So you can see it's very close, you know. I guess it was like a video game to them, you know, shooting people down the city.
It didn't look like something out of World War II. It was horrible. It was unbelievable for the late 20th century.
It was on CNN, on the BBC, on all the news networks, constantly for nearly 4 years. The ICTY was the first court to be set up since Nuremberg.
It had a lot of kind of symbolic resonance, I think, to bring charges related to taking a whole city hostage for all that time.
Nobody really expected the tribunal to thrive and succeed.
There was a serious concern that these cases may never be tried.
How do you prove that there was this siege beyond a reasonable doubt? You have to take specific incidents, specific shellings, specific snipings, and prove each one beyond a reasonable doubt. Ms. Sokolovich was walking down the street with her son, who I believe was 7 years old at the time, son Nerman, on her left side, and she was shot, and it went through her abdomen and into his head, and he died instantly next to her. And it's hard actually to talk about it without becoming emotional.
Pa eto, mogu ti reći da jest mi bolje što sam iskazala iz sebe. Iz sebe izbacila, mada ja to držim, ali mnogo je toga izišlo iz mene. Svačate li? Ja ne mogu dijete zaboraviti nikad, to je pupo sreće. I tribunal radi sine što može. I koliko može daje od sebe. Pa ne mere ni što kažu, neko mi je pomogao, meni u stvari. Meni je pomogao, a sam ja iz sebe njima iskazala sve svoje što sam imala. Meni je, ja ne znam, ja nemam ništa protiv toga tribunala. Što mogu ljudi uraditi, što ne mogu, šta će, ne mogu ni oni. Živit se mora, džaba.
I think at some point we all will have to agree on, maybe most importantly, on what to forget than what to remember.
Go for it, punish those people, find them, and so we can move on. I think as long as this thing is, not finished, we can't really move on.
The one thing you can't change is people's ability to hear and to see and to accept. And, maybe in these kinds of institutions, you're not talking to this first generation. Maybe you're talking just a little further down the line.
Well, I wish I could say that it is an irreversible forward march of justice in the world. But that's not assured. At the cutting edge, it's a fight. Every day, a struggle. And the outcome is still uncertain.
So this short clip from this story that we're trying to tell, I hope it raises for you some of the questions, some of the hard questions about international justice today. And so what I want to do now is move to really specify what are some of those purposes. Why do we have these courts, right? In this in those 10 minutes, I think you saw that there's a whole bunch of different actors, there's a whole bunch of different ideas about what these courts should be doing, why they should be doing it, who's impacted by them, right? Whether it's the soccer coach who lost 8 kids on his team in 1993 or 1994, whether it's the woman who lost her son in a sniping, which was all too common during the war, or whether it's sort of in some theoretical way the idea of what Louise Arbour says, it's sort of an assertion of law, an assertion of values. Right? What is it? Why do we have these tribunals? And what's the purpose of the trial? So I want to suggest that there's a couple of different ways of thinking about the purposes of these tribunals. And I'll start, as it's always wise to start with, Hannah Arendt, right here, who says, in case you can't read it, the purpose of a trial is to render justice and nothing else. Even the noblest of ulterior purposes can only detract from the law's main business, to weigh the charges brought against the accused, to render judgment, and to mete out due punishment. In other words, Hannah Arendt, who spent almost a year in Israel during the Eichmann trial in the early 60s, she watched the entire trial, she spoke with the prosecutors, she spoke with victims, she really sought to understand what this trial was all about, right? And she comes away from it really worried, and I really urge people to go back and read Eichmann in Jerusalem if you haven't read it or you haven't read it in a long time. It's amazing how contemporary it will feel because so many of the questions are relevant. And again, here we're talking about an Israeli court. It's still international justice, right? It's an affirmation or an implementation of international rules, but it's being done in domestic court. And she sees all this, and she sees how on different sides of the question there were people who wanted this to be a trial that was supposed to educate Israeli school children about what happened in the war, or was supposed to educate the world about the Holocaust. It was supposed to be a trial that had these broader purposes of teaching. And she didn't think that was working. She thought that at the root, it's a trial about one person's guilt or innocence. And that's the only thing that the trial can be about. It may be for others after the trial to go through the material, to try to make sense of it, to try to create a narrative. But once you go down the road of using a trial for some other purpose, in her view, you start to go down a path of making the trial into something that looks more like a show trial than a real weighing of truth, right? A weighing of guilt. So from her perspective, we need to just focus on the trial itself and just ask ourselves, is this person guilty of these crimes that are alleged? Now fast forward to 1993 again, and this is a picture of the United Nations Security Council. And on May 26, 1993, the Security Council adopted the statute for the ICTY, for the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And in the course of adopting it, they said, here's what the purposes are. Here's what we're doing. It's always nice to know, why some legislative body is doing something. Here they told you. I don't think it makes it any easier to understand which of these is more important than the others. But among the purposes are to put an end to such crimes and to bring to justice the persons who are responsible for them, kind of a straightforward accountability idea. Contribute to the restoration and maintenance of peace. Now that might be a rhetorical element. There's also an element here that in order for the Security Council to act in a situation like this, it has to act under what's known as Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. In other words, they have to act as a measure of maintaining peace and security. So it could be that this was just nothing language, it's just sort of referring to the Charter, sort of a legal issue. But as you'll see in a moment, some people took that pretty seriously, that creating a tribunal was also about bringing peace and restoring peace. And then finally, ensure that such violations are halted and effectively redressed. So in addition to just having accountability, there's an element of deterrence. Right? If we have these tribunals, if we have this particular tribunal, then maybe in the future people will think twice about whether they should actually commit the crime. We're trying to deter people in Bosnia from committing the crime. So here in the Security Council we see a mix, sort of instrumental and symbolic reasons. Right? The instrumental reasons being deterrence, right? Actually stop people from committing these crimes, and then secondly, contributing to peace and reconciliation, right? Having a real role in bringing peace to the region. And then there are these sort of expressive or symbolic purposes as well, right? Simple accountability. This isn't about some sort of cost-benefit thing. This is, as an international community, we want to assert values. We want to hold people accountable. It's not really an instrumental thing. This is what we do. And then there's the assertion of values in general that you see in there. Now, on top of all this, at the time that this is happening, there's also this ongoing question of whether this is simply, sort of from the international community, from the Security Council's standpoint, an effort to show that we're doing something. Right? We're not going to intervene to stop the war, but we're going to set up this court to hold those accountable for its worst excesses. Now, this is Antonio Cassese. He's one of the leading figures in international criminal law. He's an Italian law professor. He was the first president, the first chief judge of the ICTY. So this is at a time, so you have to sort of put your mind into 1994. There's no defendants in The Hague.